Hello everybody, this is the Wikstrand. So I very vividly remember walking out of the theater after seeing this movie, and I was so upset and I was so angry. I thought at the time it was the second worst James Bond film I had ever seen. And I didn't rewatch this movie for 15 years or something like that because I was just I don't want to watch it because it's so stupid. Halfway through it just goes conkers badonkers and never recovers and just goes insane and it's bad. But when I rewatched it for the purpose of, rewatching all the James Bond films that I have been doing for the previous month, I discovered something. I discovered that while this movie is stupid and while this movie goes completely insane at the halfway point, I would still like to rewatch this movie far more than I would like to rewatch, let's say, No Time to Die. And speaking of No Time to Die, that movie has actually lifted up many other James Bond films, because when I rewatched those ones in, comparison to that one, I said to myself, well, this was not a very good Bond film, but I would still like to rewatch it because it, had some fun to it, it had some lunacy to it, and it at least hadn't been, removed of all the fun stuff that used to be a James Bond staple. But enough about No Time to Die. Let's talk for a second about Pierce Brosnan's last James Bond adventure, and a movie that was probably severely impacted by the events of 9/11. Let's find out what happens in Die Another Day. I don't know if or how much they changed the script from the events of 9/11, but I do know that one's perception of what an action movie should be can kind of sort of change a little bit before and after 9/11. And in this day and age, that being 2002, James Bond has to go to North Korea in order to find some, credible, actual, communist, dangerous regimes. So James Bond goes to North Korea, but in a twist of event, he's actually captured, and the classical beginning of a James Bond film is actually unsuccessful, and he's being held and tortured in a North Korean prison camp. All the while, Madonna is singing one of the worst James Bond songs that has ever been sung. She also shows up as a fencing instructor that is very bad later in the movie, but we'll get to that also. But James Bond is not executed. He is traded for General Zhao, and now he is sort of on the outside with MI6. M tells him that she cannot use him anymore as a field operator, and he is now on the outside and tries to get in. I've always been a little bit, when it comes to that part of the movie, because as Roger Moore says, he is a secret agent who goes around and introduces himself to people. Half the fucking world must know who James Bond is at this point. So what was the plan originally? Was it that James Bond should, move behind the desk and, pushing pencils? I don't know. But whatever the case is, James Bond escapes from his debriefing center and is now trying to find out who set him up in North Korea, and who is this mysterious Gustav Graves who seems to never be sleeping, who has, shown up from out of nowhere. And also seems to be connected to some kind of a clinic in Cuba, where he also runs into Jinx, played by Halle Berry, who, will sort of join forces with him, sort of, in order to try to, uncover a big mystery and a threat to the world's peace and all that good stuff. And of course, eventually James Bond gets back into the game again, and together with Miranda Frost, played by Rosamund Pike, they try to, find out what Gustav Graves is up to, one of the most wealthiest men in the world. What could he ever harness for kind of a evil machinations? We shall see. Now, I loved the idea of James Bond being on the outside, trying to get in and sort of going a bit rogue. And I would have probably loved it even more if they hadn't done it for every fucking single Daniel Craig movie that has ever been made in the James Bond franchise. Come on. Anyway, so That bit was very good, and he's going to Cuba and is doing things a little bit more unorthodox without the gadgets and without the backup and stuff like that. That was good. And at the half point of this movie, this was by far the second best Pierce Brosnan Bond film. It was serious, it had stakes to it, we were into the whole thing. We had also been transported back to a golden age of James Bond, and the fencing sequence in the Gentleman's Club where a sparring contest between James Bond and Gustav Graves turns into an all-out war. It's one of my favorite James Bond moments of all time. It's fucking amazing. The sequences in Cuba was good, and the start in North Korea was really good. The gliders and the landmines and stuff like that. It looked fucking amazing. And then the movie goes into complete overload. Was this the result of 9/11? I don't know, but we then have VR, villains with diamonds in their face, and henchmen called Mr. Kill, an invisible car, an ice castle, laser beams from outer space, and other forms of total nonsense bullshit. But at the time when I saw it, I was just going, oh my god, this is bad, this is awful, this is the most cartoonish thing I've seen in James Bond since Moonraker. But in hindsight, I would say that it is very entertaining. It is very dumb, it's incredibly silly, it's complete nonsense. But as I said, I would much rather have that than some boring, depressing, dark, dull and overlong James Bond film. It is fucking insane, that's what I'm saying. But it is still very entertaining, even though the CGI looks pretty bad and some of the editing is very wonky, and Halle Berry is, how should I put this mildly, pretty fucking bad in this one. These lines were written down for her, and she said these lines in this way. This presents us with two options. Number one, Lee Tamahori thought this was a good take, which makes him a terrible director. Or B, Halle Berry couldn't get a better take out of this one, which makes her a terrible actress. Maybe it is a mixture of the two, because Halle Berry is a very mixed bag when it comes to her performances. Whenever she doesn't have a strong, stern director behind her who can help her and bring out the best in her, she can be very terrible. Case in point, Catwoman. And this movie, this is probably her crowning achievement in crap acting. Oh, also A Dark Tide. But in hindsight, I will still take cartoonish Halle Berry, who says stuff, help me James or I'm not gonna be half the girl I once was, rather than Ilga Krylenkova, who has no personality. It's just a fact. So this movie is filled with wacky, insane action sequences, and it has the hang gliding sequence, which I still say is a very big blotch on this movie's resume, because it looks fucking awful. It looked awful in 2002, and somehow it looks even worse in 2022 because there's so much CGI into it. It looks like a deleted scene from Triple X or something like that. It is also very sad in this movie that we don't have Q anymore, because Desmond Llewellyn died shortly before the premiere of The World Is Not Enough. And replacing him with arguably one of my favorite comedians of all time, John Cleese, did not help, because John Cleese seemed to only have taken the comedic aspect of Q with him and not the serious academic dryness that made that character so compelling and so fantastic. So that's also a bit of a shame. When it comes to the villains, Gustav Graves is a pretty okay villain. He's like a country club wasp with a chip on his shoulder, but I don't know if I've ever seen this dude in other movies before or after that. So I never really got into him. I got more into his henchman, the albino with the diamonds in his face, Mr. Kill, and of course our secret, not so secret villain that shows up in the third act. This movie ended in a way that a lot of action movies, adventure movies from the early 2000s to mid 2000s ended. Everybody gets a different person to fight. The girl has to fight the girl, the comedic relief has to fight the comedic relief, and the hero has to fight the villain, and that's how it was for several years. Underworld Evolution and Van Helsing springs into mind as good examples of this, and it was very, oh god, can we get on with it? It wasn't as good as I hoped it would be, but for all its flaws, For all its dumb stuff, for all its lunacy, for all its insanity, this movie is still very entertaining. It has a good pace, and despite its sometimes bad acting, and sometimes despite of its terrible editing and bad special effect, it is still a spectacle to behold. And despite the fact that this movie is technically not as good as many of the Daniel Craig Bond films, and this is a movie that you can rewatch over and over and over again because how silly and nonsense entertaining it is. It isn't serious at all, but I don't care. An all-time great fencing sequence, great action sequences, and some colorful characters do help with all the flaws that this movie has. I give this movie 62 points. It is a good movie, and the movie almost switches genre at the half point. The question is, would I have liked this movie to be either serious all the way or goofy all the way? It's kind of difficult to figure out actually, but I actually recommend this movie. So I'll see you next time for so-and-so reviewing, well, such and such. Thank you for watching. Thank you very much.